Welcome, everyone, to the third and final day of Ex-Im Bank's 2021 annual conference, Building Back Together. I'm Liz Economy, Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, currently on leave as a Senior Advisor for China to the Secretary of Commerce. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce and moderate a discussion with Jack Liu, who is a managing partner at the private equity firm Lindsay Goldberg. But of course, he's most well known for serving with great distinction during the Obama administration as the 76th Secretary of the Treasury, as well as White House Chief of Staff. His distinguished career also includes service as Special Assistant to the President and Director of the Office of Management and Budget during the Clinton administration, as well as a number of other positions in government and the private sector. Mr. Secretary, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your views. Let me dive right in and begin by asking you to say a few words about how you see the current economic recovery effort underway here in the United States, and then more broadly, what's your assessment of the global economic recovery effort, particularly with regard to China and the rest of Asia?
Well, it's good to see you, Liz, and I look forward to the conversation. I think starting with the United States, the economy is recovering and it's recovering well. I think we've seen fiscal and monetary policy tools used very effectively in a situation that was without prior experience. And what we're seeing is that as the COVID shutdown lifted, people are getting back to work with some problems. Supply chains are blocked up. Some price increases are deserve being watched carefully. But I think we have to always remember that we're coming out of an unprecedented crisis. We don't really know exactly what the course of the disease going forward is. And I think we should be grateful that over the course of the last year and a half, there has been a great deal of response to it, which is why I think the US economy is leading the global recovery now. As the vaccination rate continues, I'm hopeful that we're going to be in a place where it goes in a straight line. I don't know any better than anyone else whether that is going to be the case. We got to watch the disease. We're already seeing that the Delta virus variant has caused a slowdown from the growth. It's not a negative growth, but it's slower growth. And I think we just have to have some humility that we don't really know what September, October, November look like until we get to that point. I think it's important that the response stayed in place. I think it's important that we continue to have an effort to really stress the critical need to get vaccinated. You switch to the global economy. China in its own way responded quite aggressively, more aggressively than we did in terms of containing the virus through methods that wouldn't have been particularly acceptable in the United States, but they got their economy back up and running. When you look at how they use their governmental tools, they use them in the way that they're familiar with using them, as you know better than I do. And they supported large investment in large businesses through large financial entities. I think they're now seeing some weakness in the small and medium-sized enterprises where the balance sheets of the businesses and the individuals were hurt and they didn't get the kind of support that we saw here in the United States. I think some of the problems we're seeing in the Chinese banking system are related to that. Notwithstanding the fact that they're growing a little more slowly than they had been, they're still growing. And together, the US and China are leading the global economy. Europe was lagging behind, catching up now, maybe catching up a little faster than had been expected. I think you switch from the developed economies to the emerging economies, it's a very different story. They're in tough shape. The disease is nowhere near under control. In fact, they probably haven't seen the worst of it yet. They're way behind in terms of vaccination, and we'll get back to that probably later when we talk about things the United States could do. I think it's important for the United States, for the rest of the world to be vaccinated, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only way to contain the continued spread of new versions of the virus. I think 2 points. One, a lot of foreign debt is tied to the dollar, emerging market debt, a lot of it is tied to the dollar. As the US economy improves and our interest rates start to grow, that's going to be a especially hard blow to emerging market economies that are farther behind in terms of recovery. So I think there's some shaky days ahead in some of the emerging market economies. I think it's a good thing that the IMF came through with additional resources, and the developed countries led by the United States are making some of that room, that financial headroom available to the emerging economies. But I think it deserves our attention going forward. I mean, I always end where I began. It depends on the virus. If we continue to see the virus under control, we're in a pretty good place. We got to keep our eye on inflation, but I think things will settle in as the economy gets back to normal.
Well, that's a perfect lead-in, actually, to one of the main topics of our discussion today, which is about the Belt and Road Initiative. And you've spent a lot of time in China throughout your career. You've engaged with many members of the current Chinese leadership. And most recently, you served as co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations Belt and Road Task Force on Belt and Road Initiative, or as it's commonly known, the BRI. For those in our audience who may not be as familiar with China's BRI, it was launched in 2013 in a set of 2 speeches by China's leader, Xi Jinping. The first was in Kazakhstan, the second was in Indonesia. And as the report points out, in its initial conception, the BRI was a global infrastructure project designed in many respects to connect some of the poorer interior regions of China to external markets, and also to facilitate global trade and investment by investing in countries' hard infrastructure like ports and railroads and highways. Certainly, though, it's evolved since then to include a digital Silk Road with fiber optic cables and e-commerce and a satellite system, Health Silk Road that advances Chinese traditional medicine and medical devices, and even a Polar Silk Road to connect China more directly to Europe. Clearly, it's a very ambitious project. In some respects, I think it references exactly what you were talking about, which is, you've got an economy right now that's kind of coming, moving ahead with the United States and China, but emerging and developing economies need assistance. Talk to us about the CFR task force, why it was convened, some of its main findings.
So, I have to go back a little before the task force to when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, and what happened from the announcement to the time of the task force that made it, in my view, important to give it really serious thought. When the Belt and Road Initiative was unveiled, it was hard to criticize it because there was an enormous amount of unmet need in emerging economies for infrastructure. Neither the United States or the rest of the world were meeting that need, and China was saying, we want to help. After years of urging China to be more engaged in development, there was at least a hope that they might undertake this initiative more in the spirit of cooperative development support. And if it enhanced their image in the prospect, that's a reasonable outcome if you've done the right thing. You fast forward from 2013-14 to 2019 when the task force was convened, there was a growing sense that China had used the Belt and Road Initiative to create deep economic dependence, strategic reliance, and almost economic control in a lot of countries. And it had not really been subject to careful study, partially because it's not easy to study. China doesn't have any records to look at that say, here are all the Belt and Road projects. It's really hard to put together, hundreds of footnotes to support what you're talking about when you say what the Belt and Road Initiative has done and what it is. What we saw going in was that there were high levels of indebtedness in a lot of the countries they went to. There were degrees of dependence on China in terms of manpower, equipment that weren't building capacity, in fact, might have been undermining capacity. And there was the risk of China gaining undue leverage in some of those places. I think that one of the things that we discovered in doing the study was the hard fears are probably less real than the soft fears. What do I mean by that? The hard fears were if China's loaned money to build a port, it could seize the port and have a military beachhead. Very little evidence that what China is about is creating the ability to seize ports and have a beachhead. It's much more about gaining visibility of what's coming and going from all the key ports, having the information that gives them the ability to predict and understand what's going on around them, gaining strategic advantage that gives them tactical superiority were there to be an emergency or a conflict. And it's more subtle than coming in and just kind of raising a Chinese flag. When you look at the root of why countries engaged in relationship with China, it's pretty simple. They didn't have a lot of choices. They went to where the money was available. They didn't know what the comparative terms were because they couldn't see what other countries were doing. And when you only have one choice and you want to build a project, you take it. Now, it had the effect in a lot of countries of, instead of enhancing a good business process, of undermining a good business process. It had the effect in many countries, instead of kind of demanding honest business dealings, it looked the other way in terms of corrupt business practices. And as we saw the COVID situation developing, it meant weaker economies at a time going into a potential financial crisis in some of these countries. My own view is, it's very hard to say the idea of the Silk Road Initiative is bad. I mean, providing financing for needed infrastructure is good. Helping to build telecommunication systems where they're non-existent is good. Providing health facilities and availability of health services where it doesn't exist is good. If it's not done in the right way, though, it actually can hurt. And we reached the conclusion that there was more harm than good coming out of the way China was doing it. And it was really incumbent on us to look at what we could do, what the international financial institutions could do to try and create an alternative. Not to say we want to stop the Belt and Road Initiative, but give countries a choice. And we had, I think, a pretty robust set of recommendations, starting with what we do here at home. You look at the communications, leg of the Silk Road and of Belt and Road Initiative. We didn't have a 5G technology to compete with. So if you were putting in a telecommunication system in a developing economy, China had choices and we didn't. Nor did we team up with countries that are more friendly to our values that had 5G systems to work together to create and finance alternatives. We can't let that happen on 6G. And we can't let the rules of telecommunications practices be set so that anything other than Chinese technology doesn't meet the standards that are called for. And that means engagement. It means engagement on setting standards, engagement on working with allies, engagement on financing, and doing the basic research so we do what America is best at, developing the best technology so that we have the best to offer.
Right, I agree completely. And China plays a multi-level game, I think, as you're suggesting. It's not just about the Belt and Road and pushing forward with its own technologies. It's about, operating in the United Nations and setting the standards that are going to cement the use of those technologies as well. So when you were thinking about sort of opportunities for private sector companies in the United States, for example, what were some of your main takeaways from the task force report?
The task force didn't focus directly on what private businesses should do. It really focused on policy that could support private businesses. So, starting with the basics, we said the United States as a government it should be providing technical support so that countries undertaking projects can better understand the alternatives available to them, understand what's available through US institutions, multilateral institutions, other foreign institutions. Actually, there's more direct private lending from US institutions in the countries where the Belt and Road Initiative is than there is Chinese investment. But it doesn't come with an American flag on it. It comes with the logos of 20 different financial institutions. Some of it is coordination and steering. We think that we recommended that there be more resources available in agencies, like the Export-Import Bank, to provide both direct resources and the support needed. You know, the question of participating in international rule setting, it's not a private sector activity, but it directly relates to whether or not US businesses will be able to compete. You know, there's going to be a telecommunications agreement in Asia. It will have certain details of what kinds of systems, you know, meet the standard. If we as a country don't participate in that and help setting the standards, we shouldn't be surprised if the standards don't work in terms of products that would be made here. You know, there's with some analogy to Power Africa, which I had the privilege to work on in the Obama administration, which really did a lot of these things, bringing all of the resources of government together with businesses that wanted to do business and trying to facilitate a process. In country, one of the things that is really important is you know, setting a standard for how to avoid corrupt practices and to still be able to do business in a way that gets you across the finish line. You know, I'm not going to apologize that we have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. American businesses have to know how they can do business in an environment where they have a set of rules to follow that, you know, Chinese businesses don't have. It doesn't mean you can't do business. And that we, I think, have for a long time believed we're strengthening the countries we're helping if we can help them move from a system that has a problem with corrupt practices to one that's freer from them. So, you know, whether it's the Export-Import Bank or the Development Finance Corporation, there are tools in the U.S. Toolkit, and you're now at the Department of Commerce. We need to have commercial attaches in countries. There need to be, you know, financial attaches in countries. When I was Secretary of the Treasury and I traveled around the country, I'd see the same financial attaché in multiple countries because that financial attaché had like 5 countries in one portfolio. That's not the way that you can really provide, you know, the support that is needed.
It sounds like what you're talking about really is a whole of government approach combined with, you know, public-private partnership. You know, which is a big effort, I think, to undertake. What about the support and the partnership that we might have working with, you know, allies and others in terms of developing an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, whether it's through the IMF or the World Bank, the International Financial Institute, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, there are resources available. You know, we have to understand what it is that the countries we're going into want, and we have to be able to provide a way for them to accomplish their goal without violating our own deeply held beliefs. Let me give you an example in the power sector that is not easy to solve. You know, when I was in the Obama administration, I think correctly tried to shift financing away from coal-fired power plants. China in the Belt and Road Initiative built a lot of coal-fired power plants. That actually met the needs of those countries which had access to coal more cheaply than other resources. It's not just about saying don't use coal. You have to help them understand how can they build an affordable source of power you know, with the resources that are available. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And in the long run, we're going to regret having seen a decade of coal-fired power plant development in emerging economies. It's creating a 30-year reliance on the fuel that we need to move away from if we're going to address the climate crisis. Does that mean we should subsidize more in terms of some of the alternatives? Maybe. You know, we can't expect a country that can't afford to do something to say, I'll take that option. We have to figure out how to make it affordable. And you know, I think that in the report, we had some suggestions about how to marshal those resources, but I don't think we should think it's an easy task. It also means getting China to stop promoting the coal option, because if that option wasn't there and you want power and the funding was only available for the things that fit a more responsible long-term climate policy, we'd be on stronger footing. So the climate discussions are really not separate, and having China and the United States participate in Glasgow and setting rules that we both live with is important. And I mean, one of the things that I took away from the work on this was that when we engage with China on climate, it's not just what China does inside the borders of China, however you define the borders of China. It's a question of what China does at home and abroad, because candidly, they could clean up their new facilities in China and export coal, and the problem could get worse instead of better.
I think this is an enormously important point, and I actually think that that would have a lot of support from many of the countries where China is actually building these coal-fired power plants, because what we see, and I think what your report touches on, is that in many of these countries, there are actually protests against China's, popular protests against China's Belt and Road projects. And for example, in Kenya, there was a big protest against, an effort to develop a coal-fired power plant that, China was supporting, and eventually, it was stopped. But so I think it's there are many potential allies, I think, in this fight. But the United States is going to have to marshal them in some respect.
And I think in general, in my view of U.S.-China relations and how to deal with these transnational issues, is it's better for it not to be a bilateral discussion. I think the likelihood of China doing what we tell them to do is very low. The possibility that China will be part of a more broad discussion where the standard comes closer to what we think it should be, whether it's on telecom or on climate, is much higher. And I actually think that at a time of increased conflict between the United States and China, it's possibly a way to get the relationship back into a more normal rhythm. So I'm not pessimistic about the possibilities of making progress there. I just don't think it's going to come out of kind of direct U.S.-China discussions, which is a break from the prior 25 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So let's go back to something you raised at the outset, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. And what is that? You talked a little bit about the U.S. response and how it differed from China's response. Both for good and ill. I think in both countries there were strengths and weaknesses in each approach. But what does it make you think in terms of the U.S. response to Belt and Road, or even more broadly about the U.S.-China relationship?
So I've thought a lot about this, because I don't think there's a country in the world that would choose the Sinopharm vaccine over Pfizer or Moderna. I think that the U.S. developed vaccines are the most in demand, or Johnson & Johnson. They're the most in demand, and I think it's profoundly in our interest to disseminate that kind of support. You think about PEPFAR and what we did as a country, starting in the Bush administration, continuing through the Obama administration and beyond. The 13 million lives were saved. It probably did more to enhance the reputation of the United States in the emerging world than anything we could have done through meetings or speeches or most kinds of economic assistance. I think right now, if the United States were the leader in the international effort to get the vaccine distributed, to countries that can't afford it on their own and can't have access to it on their own, it would help us to have the relationships that later on lead to the kind of business transactions that we've been talking about, and more importantly, deepen our strategic leadership at a time when I think the world still needs it very badly. I think it was understandable at a time when we didn't have enough vaccine to vaccinate all Americans, that there was a hesitancy to kind of shifting to vaccinating the world. I'm not an expert on this. I'm not day-to-day working on it, but my understanding is we now have sufficient vaccine and sufficient booster shots for every American who's willing to get vaccinated. And our problem is convincing people to take the vaccine. That's the perfect time to pivot. And I hope that even next week at the UN General Assembly or at the meetings of the G20 and other bodies, the U.S. takes a real leadership position. I think it would be the right thing to do morally, because there's just hundreds of millions of lives at stake. But I think it's the right thing to do strategically. And I don't think it's something that is a partisan issue. I don't think you'd see it divide the country. I think it would be something that would unite the country. And if it's not for high-minded reasons of helping people in other countries, if you want to not have the Delta Epsilon, we should be doing more of this. Delta isn't the last version of COVID. Until the world is more highly vaccinated, it's a petri dish for the next version, and we know that it doesn't stay within borders. So I think it's the right thing to do for our self-interest, and it also happens to be the kind of thing which, after you do it, you feel pretty good you did.
Yeah. So let me just pivot, and I know we're coming close to the end of our time, but let me pivot to an area that I think many of our viewers will be very interested in, and that's your sense of the outlook for American business in this era of strategic competition between the United States and China. How do American companies win this competition?
So, look, I don't think it's new to the era of enhanced competition. My last few trips to China when I was at Treasury, so this would be 15, 16, I was hearing from the American Chamber of Commerce in China and from businesses in China, it's almost impossible for us to do business. We have so little confidence that we're going to get to the finish line. It's not worth the upfront expense. And we were seeing that the only businesses that really were continuing to invest in China were businesses that were already there and had the capital invested and the relationships to build on. I think we need to kind of push hard to have an opening for the kinds of conversations where American businesses don't feel that when they go to China. And that's even harder to do now in the climate of extreme tension. I think we're going to have to find a way to lessen some of the tension, which I don't think is good for either of our countries or for global stability, which doesn't mean we look the other way at things that they do that are offensive to us morally or that break the rules of fair play in terms of doing business. You actually can do both at the same time. I think it's an encouraging thing that the leaders are talking, but it would be a really important thing if there was more engagement at every level. And I think American businesses used to rely on those kinds of conversations to be places where issues that were of concern to them could be raised and moved forward. We certainly did that in the strategic and economic dialogues. We did it in our bilateral meetings that weren't as formal as that. And I think we're seeing China move to be more open in the financial services sector. It's going to have to move beyond that into services and goods. And I don't see a lot of movement there yet. I'm not saying it's bad that they're a little more open in the financial services sector, but I don't think that's sufficient for there to be any kind of real thaw. I think they need to see that the United States is approaching China, in a way that is, doesn't have the kind of character that it had in the last administration, which was so offensive that it made even people who are tough on China not want to defend the language that the administration was using, and people were considering racist. We're seeing a long tail to that. I would hope that there's an environment in which there can be a discussion of some of the tariff issues. I think they hurt the U.S. economy. Certainly doesn't help American businesses for us to be in a trade war with China if the goal is to do business in China. I've never understood the tariffs because it's a tax on Americans, and when people did their back to school shopping, they paid the tax. It wasn't being paid in China. I think the politics of getting into a space where those issues can be worked out are really hard right now. And it's going to require some kind of simultaneous confidence building on both sides, which is hard to do when you're not talking to each other. Confidence building starts with quiet conversations, then actions, and then hopefully you get into a better routine. For American business, I think they need to keep making their case for what they want in terms of the kind of business opportunities in China. They shouldn't be afraid to say that the government in China is being unfair and to ask for U.S. government support in taking up that cause. I have to say that there is some hesitancy sometimes in businesses to do that for fear that there will be repercussions on the Chinese side. My observation when I took up those kinds of issues, it ended up helping, not hurting the industries that we were advocating for, whether it was technology or agriculture, or finance. I don't think there's a simple answer because there's so many different ways that U.S. and China are economically tied together. My own view is that the idea of full decoupling doesn't make any sense for either country. The idea of having it be a chaotic, messy decoupling isn't particularly attractive either. It means you have to engage. It means you have to have some priorities. I don't think it's reasonable for us to think that China will address every concern the United States has in China. But they have to embrace the fact they have to move on some of them in order for the atmosphere to change. What's different now than it was when I was engaging with China, I used to have a list that was pages and pages long of what they needed to do to remove unfair practices, to remove humanitarian problems, to make the level playing field one that our businesses could and would want to compete on. They now have a pretty long list of things that they think we're doing to them. And I actually don't think that strengthens us. I think that what we've lost in that is it was lopsided, but we had moral superiority. They now are trying to act as if the scores are more the same. And I don't think that's great. So I, for one, think we have to figure out how to take some of that out of the dialogue, which is why I talked about the tariffs, which I criticized when they were put in place in the last administration, and I still think are not helping America.
Wonderful. With that, I think really important call to action. Let me thank you on behalf of the audience for taking the time to share your fascinating insights and for your continued service in helping the U.S. develop a smart and strategic policy to navigate one of its most complex and challenging bilateral relationships.
Thanks, Liz. Great to see you.